So there's a bit of disagreement among biblical scholars and ministers and the rest of the internet about what salt of the earth is supposed to mean. Jesus seems to have really confounded us with his message, or perhaps it's just lost in translation. Is he suggesting that the blessed ones of the Beatitudes add flavor to bland practices, as salt adds flavor to food? Or is he alluding to salt's preservational qualities, preserving a people from decay? Or perhaps to salt's unique ability to accelerate the melting of ice or boiling of water, accelerating the rate of change? It's clear he was probably not talking about cholesterol levels. Of that, we can be sure. So one idea that was new to me was this, that the word for earth can also refer to earthen oven, the kinds of shared ovens that would have been used in Jesus' day for cooking or baking bread. Made out of earth and clay, these ovens were fueled not by wood or charcoal, but by the plentiful excrement of common creatures like camels or donkeys. The dung would get mixed with salt, molded into patties, and left to dry in the sun. To get the dung to light, slabs of salt were used as catalyst. And if you think this is a far-fetched explanation or inappropriate for church, you can dismiss my fascination with it as the ramblings of my currently potty train-occupied mind. But this may well be the cultural imagery that Jesus had in mind when he says, "You are the salt that is the catalyst for the earth oven." To be salt for the earth oven is to start fires and make things burn. And if this is done, they will also then be the light of the earth. So while the quality of being a catalyst is part of this image, it is also a muddied and humble one. The noble imagery of the light of the world, a city on a hill, is juxtaposed with the common and rather dirty picture of the everyday work needed to sustain life, to feed and further families and communities. While a city on a hill or light to the nations may be at some distance from the rest of the world, salt as catalyst for the fire is right there in the thick of it, the center of the community, noble in purpose but humble in placement, and mixed in with all of that stuff that we would rather not talk about. Of course, the work of collecting and shaping the fuel would have been done by young girls or women as part of their cooking and other domestic duties. And I can imagine that the dung gatherers were not the most popular people around the dinner table. Blessed are you when people revile and persecute you. You are the salt of the earth. So during Black History Month, we often hear stories of exalted heroes, extraordinary people who overcame racial discrimination to excel in their fields. But for every person whose name is widely known, there are thousands of lesser-known names who contribute to their success. I lifted up Georgia Gilmore a few minutes ago to the children for this reason, to remember that movements are made up not just of headline grabbers, but of masses, that shifts in culture require figureheads and fundraisers, cooks and cleaners, people who do the dirty, or at least less honored work. And while MLK paid the ultimate price for his prophecy and witness, thousands of others in the freedom movement lost jobs and sacrificed in ways big and small. This week happens to be the birthdays of 3 figures of Black history: Rosa Parks, we spoke about earlier, and also Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland. While Rosa Parks is well known and lauded for her work, Trayvon and Sandra did not choose to become figures of renown, killed instead in avoidable circumstances of white vigilante justice and police misconduct and bias. These birthdays remind us of 2 lessons: the importance of learning about the unsung Black people of history, and that we are also all implicated in our own impact on Black history, Black people, regardless of our own race. Loving our Black neighbors means more than lifting up the hidden figures of history. It also means asking what impact we have had, our ancestors have had, and that we continue to have on Black people. It means coming to terms with the negative ways that those of us with white skin perpetuate racism. And it may also mean looking for examples of how to have a different, more positive impact on our Black neighbors, looking for ways to share in the down and dirty work of transforming racism. In 1954, a week before the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Andrew and Charlotte Wade, a black couple, approached Anne and Carl Breeden, a white couple, to ask them for help to buy a home. Because at that time, segregation was not just the practice, but the law of the land. Racial covenants restricted white people from selling to blacks, and redlining restricted banks and insurance companies from lending. So after growing frustrated at their inability to purchase a home in the new suburbs of Louisville that would afford them space for their young daughter and a baby on the way, the Wades were daring to challenge the system. And the Breedens, who are at that point already committed activists, didn't think twice about helping. But both families underestimated the enormous backlash to follow. A broken window and a cross burned in the lawn greeted the Wades on move-in day. Mobs approached the house as the Wades tried to settle in. Police officers sent to protect them soon began hanging out instead at the white family's house down the street. Months of death threats threatened both families. The Wades were forced to send their daughter to stay with grandparents to ensure her safety. And one night, as Andrew and Charlotte Wade stood on their porch returning from an evening out, an explosion ripped through the side of the house, the side that housed their daughter's bedroom. The family was not physically harmed, but the damage to the home was estimated at about half of the value of the house. And the situation escalated from there. Although the explosion was clearly the work of whites who were opposed to integration, the atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria in the country was at such a fever pitch that the Wades and the Breedens and a few others tangentially involved were all charged with sedition and blamed for the explosion, alleging that they were communists who were intent on stirring up race trouble. Carl Breeden was eventually sent to jail on those charges, leaving Anne, a young mother, bereft. While she entertained the idea of moving to some faraway place after Carl's release, where they could live a life of anonymity and uninvolvement, the idea was fleeting, and the Breedens maintained their active involvement in racial justice movements for the rest of their lives. So while the Wade family are the protagonists of this story, it was they who were brave enough to dare to cross the restrictive color lines and put their own lives in danger, as well as taking the financial risk. I, as a white person hearing that story, couldn't help but ask, how did this white family come to defy such overwhelming familial and societal norms to become, as some would call Anne Breeden, a race traitor? If most white people at the time enabled, or at the very least went along with segregation and Jim Crow, what could we learn from the few who didn't? The example of the Breedens shows us what it can look like when white people choose not to let black people suffer alone, but rather chose to work with their black neighbors to stoke the fires of racial justice. In 1924, Anne Breeden was born to a white family in Louisville, Kentucky. She grew up hearing stories from her great-grandmother about her great-grandfather's time in the Confederate Army. Other stories lamented the period of Reconstruction as a time of loss for their white family and friends. Another relative was locally famous as a frontier woman, proud of claiming land that would have belonged to Native peoples and for establishing a white community in its place. And somehow, out of this mythology that she inherited, Anne drew a different conclusion: that having perpetrated so much injustice, it was now the task of Southern whites to work with those that they had disempowered to set society right. From a young age, Anne was a stickler for consistency. Recounting her parents' different reactions to beggars who would approach their house from the nearby train station looking for food, she said her father would often offer an egg sandwich, but that her mother would sometimes tire of it and turn them away. And Anne remembers lying awake at night, turning over with the grave seriousness the Bible's command to feed the hungry. She feared that her mother's failure to consistently comply with this command would land her in hell. And her parents, and her father in particular, never questioned the perceived wisdom of the hierarchies in Southern white culture. The church, Anne would say, was the only window out of the pervasive racism in her home and community. The commitment to community service in her small, white, and wealthy Episcopal church meant that the members could not leave their religion behind when they left Sunday services. And in addition to the worldview it offered them, Community service through the church was the first place where she encountered poor people, which radically altered her worldview. Her involvement with the Wade family was just one small part of her lifetime of racial justice work, most notably in the Southern Conference Education Fund. So Anne heard the prophet Isaiah's disdain for worship that was divorced from mercy and justice in the world. Her faith propelled her to lean into, rather than shrink away from, the pressing questions of race, class, and inequality in her day. Her faith propelled her to not let her Black neighbors do the dirty and dangerous work of challenging segregation and discrimination alone. So while the words of Isaiah may sound dismissive of fasts and worship, they're not a refutation of the importance of religious practice, but a condemnation of religious practice separated from social action. Religious practice was central to life for the ancient Israelites. There's no way that Isaiah is suggesting that they give up these central tenets of fasting and worship, but rather he's pointing out the contradiction of doing those things without also following the rest of the commandments. The prophet is suggesting that there is no way to love God without loving your neighbor. And in the same way, Jesus in Matthew is saying that he has come to fulfill, not to abolish the law and the prophets. Jesus lifts up his Jewish tradition, urges his followers to follow it more closely. And our Christian sensibilities sometimes mistake sayings like this as a criticism of Judaism, but on the contrary, Jesus is urging a more Jewish Judaism. He's calling people to engage more deeply, more fully with their faith. Jesus tells us, "You become more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees, who were the most righteous of their day, by digging in, by doing the daily and difficult work of practicing and teaching." Having examples, Black, white, ordinary people who have seized on their own capacity to change the world, can be fuel for our own internal fires, can catalyze our own transformation from bystanders to participants. And in our own tradition, the United Church of Christ, we may find an opportunity to wrestle with the mixed legacy of our past and claim examples that we wish to carry into the future. The early Congregationists were part of the Puritan movement that left Europe in the 1600s, and they were inspired by this idea of founding a city on a hill that could be a light to the nations. But the new world that the Puritans sought to found spelled death, devastation, and displacement for the native inhabitants of North America. But we also have stories of spiritual forebears who have been salt in the earthen ovens of racial justice. There were those who were leaders in this struggle to end slavery and to create new institutions in the Reconstruction era. Before the Civil War, African American teachers went to Canada to teach fugitive slaves and prepare them educationally for life back in the United States. During Reconstruction, under the auspices of the American Missionary Association, men and women, Black and white, founded schools for freed men and women. These teachers were often reviled and hated, yet they persisted to carry out their work under the threat of violence or death. In the 1960s, our church provided sustained support for civil rights organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and participated fully in the racial justice work of the National Council of Churches. In the 1980s, we were at the forefront of struggles around pollution and racism when UCC minister Ben Chavis coined the term environmental racism. So while much of our identities and histories are handed to us, formed even before the womb, every day we have the choice to determine what actions we will take, whether we will distance ourselves from the challenging work of confronting racism, or whether we will humble ourselves enough to engage, even when it is uncomfortable or dangerous. May we hear the prophet's call to shout out. May we be willing to share in that dirty work, that all of God's people may be free. Amen.